Good day. So we are now going to talk about the final lesson of this entire monumental product.
It's always quite sad, but then I think, hey, guess what? 3 more units to go.
Yay! It is, of course, society and culture, and this covers a lot of different wee bits. Essentially, what's happening to Russian society between the start of the course, 1919, and 1939, the end of the course, and what's happened to culture as well. And the summary is really quite simple. Between 1919 to 1929, when Stalin is not in power, and it is led, culture and society is led by Lenin, and when he dies, Lenin's basic ideas. Okay, it is broadly liberal, i.e. the idea of people should be equal, people should be relatively free, and it's relatively true to socialism, idea that people are equal, people should express themselves, everyone has a right to have their own beliefs and ideas, and everyone has the right almost to a good quality of life. Then, when Stalin in 1929 has really secured his position, we have the Great Turn, where there's a change, and between 1930 and 1939, we see a much more focus on conformity, much more focus on keeping people in line, making sure that people aren't affected by Stalin. The ever-jealous Stalin does not like the liberalism, the openness, the fact that people are allowed to be different, because that means there could be a political threat. So, what we're going to do, we're going to talk about what life was like under Lenin and under his, when there's a whole struggle of power, so no one was clearly in charge between 1919 and 1929. We'll talk about the Great Turn, and then we'll talk about what it's like afterwards. So, women, the position of women is relatively to Stalin, good. Lenin is not a feminist per se, but he believes that the socialist idea of equality is not just equality between different classes, but equality between different genders. So in 1918, divorce is made easier, and 1920, abortion is made available on demand. This is the idea that women should be able to control their own destinies. They shouldn't be bound to marriage and childbirth if they don't want to. And to some extent, there is an end of something called bourgeois marriages. That's like very left-wing idea of like, that middle-class people get married, they have rings, they have ceremonies, and they stay together forever. And much more of a focus on just do what you want, be happy, women. Obviously, it's never quite that simple, but that was the intention, and you will see it's very, very, very different to Stalin. There is a broad, women should be equal to men, and we need to encourage that by giving them control of their own lives. And I'm going to massacre this, Zentadel, which is like a women's right bureau, is formed in 1919 to help advance women's equality. And women are encouraged, in order to be equal, to undertake work, because if they have work, they have their own money. They don't have to rely on a man anymore. They need no man, okay, in order to look after themselves. And if they only have to get married, therefore, if they choose. Yet,
it's Destiny's Child.
It is. Yet, despite all this positivity, attitudes in Russia amongst Russian men don't massively change. Men don't suddenly, as a result of revolution, do half the housework. Men don't really think as women as equal. There's always exceptions. There's always really committed ideological socialists who do all the equality, because that's what Lenin says, but the vast majority, as you know, aren't communist. And women still have to do most of the domestic work, and they were still seen as lesser sexist by the majority of people who were not convinced by communism. And in fact, the changes to divorce actually hurt women to some extent. By 1927, two-thirds of all marriages in Moscow end in divorce, with 70% of them initiated by men. So men take advantage of being basically whenever their girlfriends or wives get pregnant, they divorce them and move on. And so then we have women left basically having to care for a child, abandoned by their men, taking advantage of the divorce law. So actually it's counterproductive to some extent. But despite that, despite a divorce, because there's a housing shortage, women still have to live with men. And obviously this causes all sorts of problems. If you're divorced, but you have to live together, that sometimes makes life harder. And there is accounts of increased domestic violence, for example, or increased even rape in houses because of it. And although Lenin believes in equality, if you really wanted to do equality, what the government should do is create creches, kitchens and laundrettes to take away all the family work without looking after kids and looking after the home and give it to someone else. And that means women could be truly independent and work and do what they want. But there's no money for that. So women actually, although they're encouraged to work, still have to work looking after children, looking after making the food, looking after the domestic stuff, as well, and which basically adds to their family work on top of any work they want to do. So although there's the ideals are big, there's not the money to actually give women true independence. And actually even the party itself, despite the fact that they push for equality, there's inside the party, particularly at the lower levels, there's a pronounced chauvinism. There's the idea that women should know their place. For example, in 1928, only 12.85% of all members were women.
Minorities, on the other hand, well, on its surface anyway, thought could have had it good. The encouragement of freedom and equality for different minorities, Soviet republics in different areas set up, should be Soviet. They were nominally independent, however, they were really under central control. There was some groups that were allowed to show independence, national independence, such as the Georgians, for instance. Stalin himself was Georgian, and they were allowed to express their culture so long as it didn't collide with the socialist ideals. Religion, especially problematic.
Education as well is seen as a fantastic way to transform society. The average Russian might not be communist, but if you control the younger one's education, they are the next generation, and you can make them relatively good communists. So from 1919 to 1920, schools were liberalized along a line which is basically the idea that children should be in control of their own education. Teachers were now renamed school workers, and their power to discipline and their power to tell children what to do was massively reduced. And the schools in turn, rather than having head teachers, were run by older students and workers from local factories. So basically the teachers are no longer teachers. They are people who might be able to talk about stuff, but they don't have power to discipline, they don't have power to set curriculum, what you're going to learn. And so basically the kids take over, and as you can imagine, there's a massive decline in discipline.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, like all dictators at this point, or all people who are trying to get centralized control, there's a focus on physical education over the sort of the intellectual education traditionalized Western societies.
Absolutely, and in particular, physical education isn't just running around, it's manual and technical subjects, i.e. how can you be a good factory worker. It's all focused on engineering, making stuff by hand, crafting, all that sort of stuff. As well as that, they found youth groups to help encourage communism amongst younger people. There's the pioneers for those younger than 15 years, and the Kosomo of those over 15 years of age to roughly the mid-20s. They're always vague about when they need to leave. But these jobs, particularly Komsomol, they help the party, particularly attacking counter-revolutionaries and middle classes. They in fact go and help hunt out kulaks, for example, and net men when it's a big all the rage. So these people that are being sent out to do the party's bidding, and in turn being indoctrinated into communism. So there is a real attempt, okay, to create a truly socialist series of children. In reality, as you can imagine, it's not massively productive, and actually what happens is education and the quality of training that people get is much, much, much reduced.
Religion, on the other hand, is a little bit of a different story. The Bolsheviks themselves are atheists. Marx famously calls religion the opiate of the people, and as such, the Bolsheviks adopt a very non-religious, the religion is cut out of the Bolshevik program. There are a number of anti-secular, or anti-clerical, measures. In 1918, there's a decree on the separation of church and state, meaning that the church couldn't own property as it used to have been. Don't forget that the church was so intimately connected with the Romanov Tsarist dynasties beforehand. This is in many ways payback for what they considered years of oppression. In 1921, the Union of the Godless Militant was created to spread the propaganda message against the church. In 1922, anti-church property seizing campaign, 8,000 people who resisted were killed. In reality, though, Christianity endured, particularly in the countryside, but the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church is massively, massively limited. And there's some interesting propaganda. In fact, if you're in your book and you're reading about this, check out some of the propaganda pictures created by the Union of the Godless Militant. That's quite a neat... anyways, they're interesting to look at.
Another area which is affected by Bolshevism is art and culture. Lenin sees art and culture as a really good way to try and make people who are perhaps illiterate or stupid or just never heard of communism convinced about the communist cause and develop socialist values, socialist ideas of equality, etc., amongst these workers. The workers themselves were encouraged to make their own culture, and it was dubbed proletariat, basically means working classes. So, this is actually relatively successful. The proletariat movement, workers making their own art, by 1920 had 400,000 members. Lenin was relatively open to modern art. Modern art, as opposed to the sort of czarist bourgeois stuff, i.e. pictures of accurate pictures of generals and kings on battle, for example. And he preferred much more avant-garde. Avant-garde is almost brand new. If you go to Tate Modern, for example, that's avant-garde art. And if you look on the right there, that's a picture of avant-garde art. And in reality, many workers look at this and go, what's going on here? This is a good example of a futurist painting. It's not of something, it's much more new, much more modern, much more almost intellectual rather than just a picture of something. Yeah. Agitprop theatre is also used. Agitprop is like theatre which is used to encourage people to think a certain way. So there'll often be stories about bad bankers who do all this sort of manipulating, and the working class hero triumphs over them. As well as that, in 1925, the Politburo decides that they're not going to tell people what they can and cannot do. What they can and cannot read, what they can and cannot look at as art, and what they can and cannot make. This sees a massive opening up, particularly of cinema, and there are 300 million cinema tickets sold in 1928 alone. But interestingly, it's the Hollywood movies which are quite fairly popular, not these sort of semi-propaganda Bolshevik ones. But there's a relative freedom and openness. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is it will change massively under Stalin. So what there is under Stalin in 1929 is something called the Great Turn. You can also refer to it as a cultural revolution. Essentially, Stalin is in control now. And he wants to create a society which is much more obedient, much more willing to listen to him, much less independently minded. They'll do what they're told. And he believes that women, minorities, all the things we talked about should be created and changed in order to secure his own personal power. So there's a return to the idea of class warfare, like that certain artists are middle class artists, etc., etc., etc. And to some extent, what Stalin is trying to do is create conformity. By getting rid of all this independent stuff, independent women, independent art, he is trying to make everyone do what the state says. And also, to be honest, he is a chauvinist. He is fairly, women should know their place, minority, even though he's a minority, minorities should know their place. And actually, he's very old school. He doesn't like modern art, for example, and he really goes against it. He likes pretty pictures of things. And a lot of the changes reflect his own personal views. So it gets worse.
So effectively, for the position for women gets a little bit worse. Stalin was a chauvinist, as Mr. Suter just mentioned. He believed that a woman's place was in a home, yet at the same time he needed workers for industrialization and collectivization. So you see that he has to compromise his fundamental ideals a little bit. In 1930, the Zenotdel is abolished on the basis it wasn't needed anymore. The Family Code of 1936 looks to reestablish women's role in the home. Of course, the divorce and sort of the openness expressed in the 1920s and the early 1930s was starting to prove problematic as divorce and things like that became a little bit too common, and Stalin, of course, needed people. So the Family Code of 36 goes and it makes the obtaining a divorce much harder. Getting an abortion much harder, in fact illegal. Child support is introduced to encourage more children, and mothers with 6 children actually got incentives in the form of 2,000 rubles a year, and they were given free health care or free child care in the form of creches set up to help these women and encourage them to have more babies. Women, interestingly enough, who went off to work, one of the sort of dichotomies of it all was that you were expected to go to work and work a full day, but at the same time come home and take care of your family where your husband sat on the couch, if you had that, or the hard bench or chair that you owned. But anyways, long story short, women's work was never finished, and even if they went out to work in a factory or work on a collective farm, they were expected to do all of the things that they were supposed to do traditionally at home.
And that's the key thing. Like, where lots of students go wrong and explain about women in under Stalin is they say they have jobs, so they are free. Okay, that's not the case. In fact, it gets worse. They go back to being less free but also they have to work at the same time, and actually things get much worse. And now, despite all this family code stuff, marriage just goes down. Women are realize how terrible it is to be in this situation. They want their independence, so they just stop getting married. And so it's not massively effectively, although women increasingly go back to their traditional roles. Another similar area is minorities. Even though he is a Georgian, Stalin is suspicious of people who have their own identity, because if they don't feel Russian, they might not be quite as loyal as he wants. And Stalin is therefore very suspicious. And many of these minorities are on the border regions, which are strategically important, i.e. if a war starts with Germany, what's to stop the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Estonians from suddenly turning sides and helping the Germans? So he's worried about that. And essentially, he doesn't call it this, but Stalin starts his own policy of Russification. If you remember from the Tsar, that's where you basically try and crush any independent spirit, that people think that they are Hungarian, they think that they're Ukrainian, and make them think that they are Russian. People, for example, the Hungarians, the Ukrainians, and the Georgians are hit particularly hard. Ironic that the Georgians in south in the Caucasus and the south of Russia, where Stalin is from, are forced into being Russian. Stalin is always very clear he's a Russian, not a Georgian. And much like the Tsarist Russification, these groups are discouraged from wearing national dress, wearing national clothes, and doing their traditions or speaking their language. And what this is trying to do is erode the sense that they are different. Eventually, to try and make them feel like they're Russian and therefore more likely to be loyal, less likely to go, hang on, I don't like life under Russia, let's have our own state. And then as well as that, because they can't be trusted, they are discriminated against, and they're particularly banned from top positions of power, particularly in the army. If we have a Ukrainian in the army, he might use that to his power to actually control the army to rebel against Stalin. So he doesn't trust it. He wants loyal Russians. But there's a lot of discrimination. And the border regions, so areas where, particularly in the West, where like Stalin is increasingly seeing there's going to be a battle with Nazism, we see a lot of cleansing. Now, this isn't ethnic cleansing where people are being killed. But families from Estonian or Finns, or basically identities which aren't Russian, who are a bit suspect and seen as unreliable, are deported. Some are either kicked out and sent to Finland or sent to Poland, but many more are just moved to basically the central Russia forcibly. And they have no choice. They're forced to go to central Russia, where they can be kept an eye on, and they are less of a sensitive location. A good example of this, close to my heart, obviously, in 1936, 172,000 Koreans, every Korean in pretty much in the east of Russia, that sort of cold Mongolian Chinese region, are moved to the center of Russia, to modern-day Uzbekistan, because they are seen as being a potential spy for Japanese. He's got no grounds for doing this, but he just forcibly moves his families, forcibly changes their entire lives, and they lose all their stuff. This is very much chauvinism.
An interesting point to make here is sort of the self-fulfilling prophecy of all of this. This is really just a historical aside, but his harsh treatment of minorities, particularly those in the border regions, by having them deported or shipped out, obviously breeds a distrust and a dislike for Russia and extreme dislike for Stalin. And anyone who is left and happens to have been on the side of, near where the Germans invaded in 1941, oftentimes those people themselves are happy and welcome the Germans as liberators from the Stalinist authorities. And this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy really, really, truly plays out, where they were mistreated, therefore they don't like Stalin. The Germans came and did exactly what Stalin was worried about them doing, and having these people sort of flip and support the Germans. In 1944, 1945, and 1946, after the Russians had taken over those areas, once again, at the end of the war, these minorities are brutally treated. So Stalin again comes back and takes the problems in education and he makes them much more traditional. He wants to use education, of course, like all good dictators, to try and instill a new, faithful, believing generation with the ideals of Stalinism, the ideals of communism, to make them completely loyal to him and potentially remove any potential long-term threat to his rule. So he saw that education was a great opportunity to indoctrinate the youth. The old teachers were driven out. There was a return to traditional teaching and discipline with an emphasis on textbooks and authorized learning. And of course, these authorized learning textbooks were written by the Communist Party and talked about propagated the myths that they wanted to know, that Lenin, of course, wanted Stalin to become the next leader of Russia, for instance, or that the October Revolution was in fact a bloody, glorious affair rather than them walking into an undefended Winter Palace. There's an emphasis on socially useful work, factory work. There's a narrow emphasis depending on local industry. For instance, people in Central Asia were taught how to pick cotton, poultry breeding specialists. They were made poultry breeding specialists and so on. So depending on the needs of the area, education could be tailored to further the interests of the local industry, for instance.
Creating basically loyal workers. And as well as that, the pioneers and the Komsomol are used further as vehicles for Stalin. They're used increasingly to advance Stalin's sort of agenda. The Komsomol in particular used to hunt down kulaks, are used to find people who are in the purges. And there's a really interesting story in Pavlik Morozov. Okay,
I really like this one.
Do you want to
long story short, one of the things that at the time of the purges could land you in a gulag was broad denunciation. And as we see in the story of Pavlik Morozov, which is actually in your book, he is someone who denounces his parents. His parents had said, his dad had said something offhand, just slightly anti-communist, and as such, Pavlik Morozov went to school and denounced his parents because he was so thoroughly indoctrinated with the educational values of Stalin, which ended up having his dad being killed, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. And then Pavlik himself was murdered by his grandfather for obviously betraying his father and his grandfather's cousin in the woods, and this becomes a huge cause. In fact, there's because Stalin sees a loyal Bolshevik, a young loyal Bolshevik, who's been murdered by his backwards grandfather. So grandfather and pretty much the entire family is wiped out. But Pavlik has statues. He's celebrated in Pravda. In fact, the pioneers, the top rank of pioneers is named the Pavlik. Okay, he is seen as a model for the ideal youth, not loyal to his family.
Your school text exercise book, for instance, would have his face smiling at you, reminding you to be like Pavlov.
And the big thing he was loyal to Stalin, loyal to the party, loyal to communism over his own family. And this is fantastic, because if you're a parent and you know your kids might be a spy, you aren't going to say anything. As well as that, religion is seen as a fantastic opportunity to further crush. Obviously, this is a bit different because communism has never liked religion, so he's more continuing and extending Lenin's sort of world. But Stalin is very suspicious of religious people because they owe loyalty to a priest, they owe loyalty to a mullah, they owe loyalty to a rabbi, and they are part of an organization which is not controlled by the state. Potentially, they can be inspired to rebel. So he decides he wants to destroy them. He creates something called the League of the Godless to spread much more anti-religious hate and also beat up, attack, burn down, and basically become something we call a paramilitary. That means officially not run by the government, but run by the government unit to attack churches. And there's a more direct challenge from the church, basically trying to close them down. By the end of 1930, 80% of village churches have been closed, and by 1939, only 1 in 40 still function. And there's a particular attack on the religious leaders. Like he realizes he can't just wipe out every Christian, because actually there's still a lot of believers, and that'll cause a lot of problems. So even by 1937, for example, 50 million people on a census say they have religious belief, and if 50, they're like the outliers. You don't say you're religious on a census unless you're really, really committed. And there's a lot more than that. But the people he can attack are the leaders, because the leaders are the people who are connected, who know everyone, who therefore could lead a rebellion against him. So, for example, in 1930, of all the bishops that existed, the 168 that were in 1930, by 1939, only 12 of them are alive or not in prison. Okay, so really he wipes out the top, and particularly the same for the mullahs, the Islamic mullahs, and the rabbis. Same thing. Get rid of leadership. There is more of a little bit of an attack on the worshippers, but you don't kill all the worshippers. You kill the leaders. Mosque in Islamic law is particularly banned, partly because in the Southern Caucasus region, everyone is Muslim, and that seems a particular threat. So they decide to ban all of that. The study of Hebrew is banned, as well as synagogues are being closed down. This is an assault. It definitely decreases the power of religion, but there are still religious beliefs. Secretly, there is still religious belief. And it's important to realize that it's very crude in an essay to say Stalin didn't wanted to be God, and he therefore got rid of God. It's not that simple. Essentially, Stalin sees an organization, a potential for organizing against him, so he wants to crush that.
So with art and culture, Stalin again changes his mind. He starts to see modern art as strange and disturbing. He preferred more propagandist art, stuff that emphasized obedience and the honor of work. So what then becomes created is something known as socialist realism, sort of a school of art that tries to portray the socialist or the communist movement in Stalin and Lenin himself in many ways as heroic, as avant-garde, instead of rather these sort of
random shapes.
Yeah, random shapes and, you know, sort of pseudo-intellectualism, as he would have thought, of the modern art movement that was developing. So you get things like the Russian Association of the Proletarian Writers, dominating writing and marginalizing those who did not toe the line. Artists and filmmakers who didn't conform to something that would more broadly along the thinking of Stalin were forced out of their jobs and they're kicked out of their professional bodies. And of course, these professional bodies were controlled by the communists and loyal people who were loyal to Stalin and were willing to make films that glorified both Stalin and the regime were favored and put in place. Essentially, basically, all of this became a wing of the cult of personality and propaganda, enforcing the fact that Stalin is the great leader. So this really just goes on to develop the cult of Stalin, and you saw this when we looked at the sort of the propaganda of the cult of Stalin lessons, the fact that, you know, artists are portraying him as effectively godlike in many ways.
And I think the key thing is there's no independent thought. Everyone toes a line. No one gets ideas of independence. It's all this emphasis on communism good, Stalin good, you should do what you're told. So the big focus, a big change which confuses people, I don't know quite work out why, but is the Constitution of 1936. Essentially, the USSR is being criticised, somewhat unironically, for being totalitarian and unfree internationally. So what do? They say, we have created the Constitution of 1936, the freest document, giving Russians more freedom than anyone else. This promises secret ballots, elections for leaders, human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, universal suffrage, i.e. everyone has the right to vote at 18. This is a hugely democratic document and is announced to the world with much fanfare. It's shown to the world, look at how free Russia is compared to everyone else.
But, and there's always a but, there are massive limits. Of course you can have freedom of speech as long as you say things that go along with what the party wants you to say. Of course you can vote, but you can only vote in elections where there was only one party. That was the Communist Party, and therefore you could only vote for deputies who were chosen by Stalin and so on and so forth. These weren't actual fair and free elections. And yes, certainly everyone could vote for them, but when you have a choice of one person and one person alone to vote for, it's not necessarily democracy, is it?
There's a particular story in Leningrad, and I think it's 1937, where the election results are announced before the election, and then they realise they retract it, and then they re-announce it when they have the election again. Obviously, the whole thing is pointless because there was not one name on the ballot.
So the Constitution of 1936 is more propaganda than anything else. It's like, hey, look how free we are. In reality, they weren't.
Absolutely right. So, and on this emotional moment, this brings us to the end of this unit. I think to some extent, the key thing about this entire course is that what they mostly ask about is why did X happen and what was the effect of X. And when you look at your notes, we're not just looking at stories, not looking at facts per se. Obviously facts are important, but you need to make sure, can I explain why the industrialization happened, why the purges happened, why someone won the power struggle, and the effect of all of these things. So always focus.
What happened to women, what happened to the people, what happened to industrial production. So always think of cause and effect, as Mr. Suter just said, and keep in mind that there's lots to do, and you can always go back and listen to any one of these 15 lessons, and we'll be happy to share with you our thoughts and ramblings at your will via the links provided for you in class. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this walk through Russian history, 1905, give or take, to 1939. I've enjoyed it. I don't know about you, Mr. Suter.
It's been all right.
One of the only ways, actually one of the things keeping me going here at this really relatively sad moment at the end of the lesson is the fact that we have Cold War next.
Oh, wonderful. We'll be doing that shortly, I assume.
Absolutely. So guys, have a great day, great night, great morning, wherever we happen to find you. Once again, I'm Mr. Raine.
And Mr. Suter.
Take care.